Tobias Ferraro almost stepped on her. He'd come out into the garden at first light the way he always did. Cigar unlit. Between his fingers, the frost still silvering the hedges of the Providence estate his family had bled to keep, and there she was folded onto the cold stone bench beside a scuffed suitcase, a canvas bag hugged tight against her stomach like it held the last thing she owned in this world. Marlowe Quinn, the maid he'd had thrown out the day before, 27 years old, a housemaid in a gray uniform stripped of its brass buttons, her dark hair damp with dew, the tracks of dried tears cutting white lines through the dust on her face. Her hands told the rest of it chapped at the knuckles, ink worn permanent into 2 fingers, the hands of a woman who counted things for a living and scrubbed floors to survive. She'd sat out here the whole night. Tobias knew it the way he knew the ground under his own boots, because his men had turned her away at the gate at dusk, and she hadn't left. She'd waited in the dark, in the cold, on a bench in a killer's garden, just for the chance to look him in the eye and tell him the truth that she hadn't stolen a thing, that she'd been framed, that someone inside his own house wanted her gone before she talked, and exhaustion had finally taken her, the way it takes a body that's got nothing left. Tobias stood over her, a man the whole city of Providence whispered about behind locked doors, a man who'd ordered worse than an eviction and never lost a night's sleep over it, and he found he couldn't move, because he'd seen that particular kind of sleep before the way she'd fallen with her arms locked around her own belongings, guarding them even unconscious, ready to be robbed, ready to be left. A body only sleeps like that when it's learned to expect the worst from people. And then his eyes dropped lower, to the curve beneath the canvas bag, to the swell her folded arms had been hiding all along, and something in Tobias Ferraro's chest went cold and still. She was carrying a child, 4 months along, maybe more, and a man who prided himself on never asking a question he didn't already know the answer to suddenly had 100 of them, and every single one led back to a single night in that house he'd spent months trying to forget. He crouched down slow. He didn't wake her. A big man crouched over a sleeping woman in the dark was every nightmare she'd ever earned, and he wouldn't be that. Not to her, not this morning. Instead, he slid one arm behind her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, and he lifted her against his chest, and she came up with a soft, startled breath, and her head dropped to his shoulder, and he carried her not to the gate, not to a car to be driven off his land, but up the stairs of his own house, into his own room, and he laid her down on his own bed like she was made of glass and drew the blanket up over her. "Nobody gets left behind on my ground," he said low, to no one at all, and the words came out rough because they weren't just words to Tobias Ferraro. He'd said them once before, years ago, kneeling on a cold sidewalk with his little sister's hand going still in his, while a whole street watched from behind locked windows and not one single door ever opened. Whatever this woman was, thief, liar, or the one honest soul left in his house, she wasn't going to be left in the dirt. Not on his ground. Not this time. If you believe one act of kindness can still change everything, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs it tonight. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss what happens next. Now let's get back to Marlowe, asleep in the bed of the most dangerous man in Providence, and the secret she'd carried up those stairs with her. Tobias stood silently at the edge of the bed for a long while, looking at the sleeping woman, and not understanding why his feet still refused to carry him out of the room. No one else had ever slept in this room, not since the day he moved into the mansion after the retirement of his aging father, and the blood-soaked years of rebuilding the Ferraro empire from its ashes. And yet now a maid he had just thrown out the door was lying there, her breathing steady and thin, one hand still half closed as though even in sleep she was holding on tightly to something. He knew that sleeping posture. He had learned it not from books, but from his own flesh, long ago during his turbulent youth, and the world had not yet taught him that mercy was a luxury men like him were not allowed to keep. That memory had never left him. It had only lain dormant, like a chained animal, and tonight the image of the woman curled in on herself had awakened it. That night had been cold like this too, back in the grim days in the old neighborhood on the south side of Providence, where the Ferraro family had been nothing yet but a name people spat on behind their backs. Rosalind had been only 19. His little sister, the beloved daughter of the Ferraro house, had a crooked little smile and a habit of bursting into laughter at the moments when laughter was least appropriate, a habit that made their mother scold her even while she couldn't keep herself from laughing along. That night, Rosalind was walking home from her part-time shift at the bakery, only 3 blocks from the house, when a score settling between 2 rival gangs spilled out onto the very street she was taking. A stray bullet, aimed at no one, carrying no name, buried itself in her back and knocked her down onto the sidewalk in front of rows of lighted windows. Tobias had run there when he heard the gunshots, running on the legs of a boy who had not yet had time to become a man, and he found his sister lying there on the cold cement, her lips trembling as she called his name, her hand clutching his more weakly with every passing moment. He had screamed. He had pounded on every door, beaten his fists against every gate, begged for a telephone, a car, a hand, anything at all, and the whole street had watched. He knew they watched, because he saw the shadows behind the curtains, saw living room lights snap off as he ran past, saw faces slide across panes of glass and then turn away. Not a single door opened, not because they hadn't heard, but because they had heard too clearly, and the Ferraro name back then had been enough to turn indifference into a reasonable choice in the minds of decent people. People didn't save the daughter of a family the whole neighborhood was praying would burn itself out. Rosalind died in his arms in a pool of her own blood, beneath the jaundiced glow of the streetlight, 15 minutes before the ambulance that he himself finally had to crawl to a public phone booth to call managed to roll onto the street. 15 minutes. He had counted every one of those minutes for the rest of his life. He knelt on that sidewalk long after her heart stopped beating, his hand still wrapped around hers as it slowly went cold, and in the brutal silence of the locked houses around him, he made himself one single promise, not revenge, not blood for blood, but something simpler and heavier than all of it. No one would be left behind on his ground. No one, never, as long as he still had a roof and a breath inside his chest. That vow had followed him up every rung of power, through smoke-filled rooms and agreements written in fear, through everything he had become, so the Ferraro name would never again be something that made people dare to turn away. People called him ruthless, and they weren't wrong, but that ruthlessness had grown out of a cold sidewalk where kindness had been absent at the very moment it mattered most. Now, standing in the warm room of his own house, watching a strange woman sleep with her arm half folded as if sheltering her belly, Tobias felt 2 moments, 15 years apart, folding over each other until it made him dizzy, the same posture of a person who had learned not to expect anything from anyone else, the same look of having been abandoned. He thought of his men stopping her at the gate at dusk, thought of the servants in the house passing her throughout the afternoon, without a single one of them stopping, and a cold anger rose in him, not anger at her, but anger at the truth that the world was still exactly as it had been on the night Rosalind died, still full of closed doors and eyes that turned away. But along with the anger came something else, sharper and far more unpleasant, a suspicion of himself. Because he couldn't forget that he was the one who had ordered her cast out. It was his cold signature on the accusation of theft that had pushed her onto that stone bench outside. He, the man who had sworn never to leave anyone behind, had somehow still been able to become someone else's closed door without even knowing it. The thought made his jaw tighten. He pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, bracing his elbows on his knees, and he watched her sleep as though, if he looked long enough, he might be able to read the truth on that exhausted face. Truth or deception, innocence or guilt. Her belly lifted faintly with each breath, and every time it rose and fell, the number 4 months echoed in his head like a knock on a door he wasn't ready to open. He didn't allow himself to walk all the way down that path of thought, not tonight. But he knew, with all the cold certainty of a man used to calculating every move, that whatever the truth about this woman might be, he wouldn't sign another name onto another sentence until he had looked her straight in the eyes and heard her speak for herself. Outside, the Providence dawn was rising slowly behind the trees, and Tobias Ferraro sat guard over a stranger's sleep, carrying inside him an old sidewalk he had never truly stood up and walked away from. Marlowe woke the way someone wakes when she has grown far too used to opening her eyes in unsafe places, which meant her eyes flew open all at once. Her whole body went rigid, and her hand was already searching for the suitcase before her mind had even managed to understand where she was. An unfamiliar ceiling, high and dark, an old brass chandelier, the scent of cedarwood and faint cigar smoke lingering in the air, the heavy blanket covering her body so soft that the softness itself frightened her. She sat up too quickly, and dizziness swept through her head, one hand pressing instinctively against her belly, while the other groped blindly, until it touched the strap of the cloth bag placed right beside the pillow. And only when her fingers tightened around it did she manage to let out a breath. The suitcase stood at the foot of the bed, untouched. No one had gone through her things. The first thought that flashed through her mind was not gratitude but suspicion, because in Marlowe's life, no one had ever done anything kind for her without attaching a price to it, and she had learned long ago that kindness without an obvious cost was usually the most expensive kind of all. Then she saw him. Tobias Ferraro was sitting in the armchair beside the window, one leg crossed over the other, his elbow resting on the chair arm, watching her with the calm of a man who had been sitting there for a very long time and was in no hurry at all. Morning light fell slantwise across one half of his face, leaving the other half in shadow, and in that instant she realized she was inside the bedroom of the most powerful man in Providence, the man who had signed the order to throw her out as if crossing out an unnecessary line in a ledger. She pulled the blanket off her body, swung her legs down to the floor, and stood up, a little unsteady but standing all the same, the suitcase drawn close to her feet, the cloth bag held against her chest. Because Marlowe would rather face the devil on her feet than lie beneath his blanket, he didn't rise. He only said, in a low voice that did not need to be loud, that she had fainted in the garden and he had carried her in here, nothing more and nothing less, and she didn't need to look at him as though he were about to devour her. Marlowe said nothing. She knew the value of silence. It was the only thing someone in her position could own completely. He watched her for a while, then went on, saying that by now she should have been on the other side of the city and never allowed to set foot on this property again, that people didn't return to the Ferraro house after being dismissed for theft, that doing so was foolish to the point of being almost stubborn. She lifted her eyes and looked straight into his, and for the first time she spoke, her voice hoarse from an entire night in the mist, but not trembling at all, saying that she had come back not to beg, but because she was not a thief, and a person who had stolen nothing, had no reason to run away as though she were guilty. Something passed through his eyes, not exactly surprise, but attention, the kind of attention a predator gives when it realizes its prey has not run in the direction he expected. He said everyone claimed to be innocent. She answered that yes, they did, and that was exactly why words were worth nothing. Only records didn't know how to lie, and if he let her see the exact ledger pages that had been used to frame her, he would see for himself what the numbers said. He was silent for quite a while after that, and Marlowe could feel that she had struck something he had not expected, because a maid was supposed to cry and plead about children she had to feed, or an ailing old mother, not stand there talking to a kingpin about ledgers, in the voice of someone who knew exactly what she was saying. He stood, and even though she had braced herself, his height and the weight of him, when he straightened still, seemed to make the room shrink, but she did not step back, only lifted her chin a little higher. He told her she had 5 minutes. 5 minutes to tell the truth, the whole truth, without adding or taking away a thing, and he added in a voice cold as steel that if, during those 5 minutes, he caught her in even one lie, then she would understand for herself that patience was not something he was famous for having in abundance. Marlowe gripped the bag strap so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and she understood very well that there were truths she couldn't speak inside Bruce. Not because they were lies, but because they were more dangerous than lies. The truth about the life growing inside her, and about the night that had created it, was something she would bury at the very bottom of herself. Because if she spoke it aloud, she would become exactly the kind of woman she despised most, the kind who used a child to buy pity. So she drew in a breath, set the bag down on the edge of the bed, but kept one hand on it, and looked directly at the man who was measuring her with the eyes of someone used to putting a price on everything. And then she began to speak, choosing each word like someone walking across thin ice, deciding that she would give him the truth about the numbers, every truth about the numbers, and not one word about anything else. 5 minutes, she thought, 5 minutes to save her honor, and at the same time, keep hidden the one thing that could destroy it, and she began counting down in her head the moment she opened her mouth. Marlowe began at the beginning, not with the night she was thrown out, but with 3 weeks earlier, because she knew a story was only believable when people could see the first link in the chain. She told him that her duties in the mansion were not limited to cleaning, but also included recording the household staff expense ledger, the purchases of food, liquor, fresh flowers, supplies, the small numbers no one bothered to look at, and precisely because no one looked at them, they had handed the task to a maid, but she was not the maid they thought she was. She told him, not with pride but simply as if presenting a fact, that she had studied accounting for 2 years in college before she was forced to leave because her father had drowned himself in gambling debts, that numbers to her were not dead symbols lying on paper, but a language she could read as fluently as other people read the face of someone they loved. And that language, 3 weeks ago, had begun telling her that something was wrong. She told him that while she was comparing the staff expense ledger against the actual invoices, she kept stumbling over discrepancies. Not large enough to be obvious, just a few $100s here, a strange rounded sum there. A wine supplier paid twice in the same month for the same shipment, a repair invoice for a warehouse she had never heard anyone mention. Taken separately, each number could be explained, but she said, and this was where her voice lowered slightly, because she knew she was touching something dangerous, when she added all those small discrepancies together and traced them back over 6 months. They were no longer random mistakes, but formed a shape, a steady and deliberate current, money leaving the Ferraro house through channels that had already been dug. She told him that the mistake she made was taking her questions to the very person she should never have asked, Wesley Dorn, the family's chief accountant, the man who managed the entire set of major ledgers into which her staff ledger flowed, like only one small branch. She said she had believed she was doing the right thing, believed he would thank her for discovering the leak, but the look he gave her that day was not the look of a grateful man. It was the look of a man who had just realized the guard dog had caught the scent of blood. 3 days later, the Ferraro family heirloom jewelry, the emerald necklace and earrings his grandmother had left behind, and that were still kept in the glass cabinet in the grand parlor, was discovered missing, and a single earring was found in the drawer of Marlowe's bedside table, wrapped in her own handkerchief. She recounted it in an even voice, almost calmly, but her hands were clasped tightly together. And she told him that even now she still didn't understand why only one earring had been planted among her things instead of the whole set, until she realized the entire set was too valuable to throw away. They only needed one small piece, enough to accuse her, while the rest disappeared into the very current she had accidentally seen. She said she had no proof, and she stressed that point, that she wasn't standing here to accuse anyone, because if she did that, she would be no different from the person who had accused her. She was only standing here to say that a person who wanted to steal a set of jewelry would take the whole set and sell it, not hide one piece in her own room like a written confession, and that the timing of her being framed, 3 days after she asked Wesley about the numbers, was a coincidence that anyone who knew how to read ledgers would see was far too neat to be accidental. Tobias listened to all of it, without interrupting her even once, and when she stopped, the silence in the room stretched long enough for her to hear the pendulum clock in the hallway. He did not believe her completely. She could see that on his face, the cold, weighing look of a man who had heard too many good stories, and learned that the better a story was, the more suspicious it became, because Wesley Dorn had kept the family's books for nearly 20 years, had passed through 3 purges unharmed, had been a man his father trusted, and a man Tobias had never had any reason to doubt, while she was only a maid who had worked there for less than a year with an emerald earring in her drawer. But he did not dismiss her outright either, and that was what made Marlowe's heart beat faster, because she could see he was doing exactly what she had hoped he would do. He was calculating. He asked her one question only, his voice slow, asking that if he let her see those ledger pages again, today, would she dare point out every number in front of him? Or was this merely the story of someone who knew she would never be forced to prove it? Marlowe looked straight at him and said that she not only dared, she begged to do it, because ledgers were the only thing in this world that had never betrayed her, and if he gave her enough time with them, they would speak the name her mouth did not dare to call. Tobias didn't answer her right away. He stepped to the door, opened it, and called a name down the hallway, and only a few minutes later, A woman close to 60 entered the room with the straight, unhurried stride of someone who had ruled this place for so long that every brick seemed to know her name. It was Odette Lambert, the head housekeeper of the Ferraro mansion, a woman with salt and pepper hair twisted neatly at the nape of her neck, her face stern, marked by deep lines around the corners of her mouth that hadn't come from smiling often, but from pressing her lips together again and again to keep her thoughts sealed inside. Tobias said briefly that Marlowe would remain in the mansion until he had cleared up the matter of the jewelry, that she wouldn't be locked up, but she wouldn't be free to move about as she pleased either, that Odette would be responsible for watching her and reporting everything back to him, and he said the final sentence in a voice that made both women understand this wasn't kindness, but an investigation. She was here because he needed her somewhere he could see her, nothing more. Marlowe understood that, and she nodded without thanking him, because she knew that thanking him for a decision like that would only lower herself. After Tobias left to deal with the business of a morning in his world, only the two women remained in the room, and Odette stood there looking at Marlowe for a long while, with sharp eyes that had watched 3 generations of servants come and go through this house, eyes that weren't easily deceived. She told Marlowe to follow her, then led her out of the master's bedroom, along a long marble hallway where portraits of the Ferraro ancestors looked down with the gaze of dead people still keeping watch over the house, down one floor, to a much smaller room that was clean and warm in the area once reserved for guests, not the servants' quarters in the basement where Marlowe had stayed before. Marlowe noticed the difference at once, and the housekeeper knew she had noticed, but neither of them said anything about it. Odette moved around the room, drawing back the curtains to let in the light, checking the water pitcher, and as she did those things with practiced hands, she watched Marlowe in the way only a woman, who had given birth and cared for many other women could. She saw the way Marlowe sat down on the edge of the bed, one hand instinctively supporting her lower back, a small gesture Marlowe herself didn't notice, but Odette read it immediately. She saw the girl's face, slightly pale, and the way she swallowed hard when she caught the smell of coffee from a tray someone had left in the hallway, a smell most people wouldn't think twice about, but one that made her turn her face slightly away. Odette said nothing about what she saw. She only quietly carried the coffee tray farther from the doorway, and a little later she came back with a warm cup of ginger tea and a few salted crackers, setting them on the table beside the bed, without explaining why, only saying that people's stomachs were often uneasy in the morning after a night in the mist. Marlowe looked up at her, and in that moment something wordless passed between the two women. Marlowe understood that this woman had guessed, and Odette understood that Marlowe knew she had guessed, but both of them chose to let it rest in silence, because there were things that became weapons in other people's hands if spoken too soon. Odette only said, in a voice stern but not cold, that walls had ears in this house, that some people walked very softly and listened very clearly, and that if Marlowe was wise, she should keep her mouth shut about everything, until she was certain who could be trusted. She pressed lightly on the word everything in a way that made Marlowe understand she wasn't only talking about the ledgers. Then, before leaving the room, Odette paused at the threshold, turned back to look at the girl once more, and added a sentence that sounded almost casual, saying that she'd served this house for 30 years, had seen many girls come and go, and had learned one thing, that the master might be ruthless with his enemies, but he'd never, not once, abandoned a person who truly had nowhere to turn. So if Marlowe was as innocent as she claimed, then she had accidentally fallen into the very house she should fallen into, and if she was lying, then this was the worst house in the world to do it in. After saying that, she closed the door very softly, leaving Marlowe sitting alone in the warm room with the ginger tea still steaming, one hand resting on her belly, feeling for the first time in many days that someone in this house had seen her, truly seen her, and not knowing whether she ought to be frightened or grateful for it. Sitting alone with the cup of ginger tea slowly cooling in her hands, Marlowe let her memory drift back to the night she had promised herself she would never allow herself to think about again, the night 4 months ago, when the entire Ferraro mansion had lurched like a ship, striking hidden rock. It was a late winter night, and she had only been working there for a few months, still nothing more than the invisible shadow-cleaning hallways no one ever noticed. when a frightened cry rang out from the east wing, followed by the thunder of running feet, and someone shouting for an ambulance. Silvio Ferraro. The aging father, the boss who had stepped back from the front, but whose name still stood as the pillar holding up the whole family, had collapsed from a stroke right inside his study. For the hours that followed, the house became a chaos of private doctors, cold-faced men coming and going, while speaking in low voices, phone calls made in every direction. And in the middle of all that noise, Marlo did the only work she knew how to do. She poured coffee, wiped up spilled water, stood pressed against the wall, and made herself small so no one would trip over her. Sometime after midnight, when Silvio had been taken away and the doctors said he would survive, but the road ahead would be long, the house fell into a silence heavier than the chaos had been, and the men left one by one, leaving Tobias alone in his father's study. When Marlo went in to clear away the glasses, she found him there, not the Providence kingpin, but a man collapsed in a chair, with a bottle of liquor already more than half empty, his tie loosened, his bloodshot eyes staring at the fireplace where the flames had died down to embers. She should quietly withdrawn. That was what a maid was supposed to do. But something in the way he sat that night kept her from lifting her feet and walking away, because she recognized that posture, the posture of someone who had almost lost what he loved and had been powerless to do anything about it. The same posture she had once seen in herself in the mirror during the years her father was sliding downhill. He looked up and saw her, and instead of sending her away, he spoke, his voice thick with liquor and with an exhaustion deeper than liquor, asking her whether she had ever been afraid she would become the very thing she hated. Marlo shouldn't have answered, but she did, and somehow two people standing at the farthest ends of the world sat there talking to each other in the dying firelight. He spoke about the father who had nearly died, the man he had spent his life both loving and fearing, about the burden of a name he hadn't chosen to carry, about the loneliness of being someone everyone needed but no one truly saw. And she, for the first time in that house, spoke about herself, about the father who had lost everything to numbers she hadn't been able to save him from, about the education she had been forced to leave unfinished, about the feeling of always standing at the edge of other people's lives. That night held no schemes, no calculation, only two lonely human beings who happened to see each other at the exact moment when both were most exposed, no kingpin and no maid left between them, only two people abandoned in different ways, finding in one another a little of the warmth they both lacked. And that warmth, in the weakness of a night that should never have happened, went farther than words. Marlo didn't allow her memory to linger there too long. She kept only what she needed to keep, that it had been real, that it had been tender, and that it had belonged to her alone before morning came and took it away. Because when dawn rose, when cold light poured in and with it all the weight of the real world, the Tobias Ferraro she met again was no longer the man from the night before. He stood by the window, clean-shaven, his tie fastened again, his cold shell pulled over him like armor, and when she entered, he looked at her as though looking through glass, as if she were an object in the room, and not the person who had sat with him through the night. He said, in a flat voice stripped of feeling, that the night before had been the mistake of a weak man, that it would never happen again, and was best never mentioned, and he left something on the table, perhaps money, though she never looked to know, because in that very moment something inside her had closed forever. She understood at once, with the ruthless clarity of someone used to being looked down on, that to him she was only one moment of weakness that needed to be erased, and she had nodded, turned away, and returned to being the invisible shadow, cleaning the halls as though nothing had ever happened. She didn't know, for many weeks after that the night he wanted to erase had left inside her something that couldn't be erased, a small life quietly growing, carrying half the blood of the very man who had looked at her as though looking through glass. And now, 4 months later, sitting in the warm guest room of the mansion, with her hand resting on her belly, Marlo closed her eyes and told herself that this secret would die with her, before she ever let it turn her into someone begging for pity. Marlo opened her eyes and pulled herself back to the present, and with the present came the decision she had made on that cold morning 4 months ago, and had not once allowed to waver, that the man would never know the child was his. She sat there, lightly stroking her palm over her belly, thinking of all the reasons she had to keep silent, And the greatest reason was not fear but something far harder, her pride, the only possession that a lifetime of poverty had not managed to take from her. She knew very well that if she opened her mouth and told the truth, everything in this room would change color at once. She would no longer be the wrongfully accused woman standing up to demand justice with her own mind, but the maid who had become pregnant by her master and then come back to claim her share. And the look Tobias gave her, the look in which she had only just earned a small measure of respect, would instantly become the suspicious look reserved for every opportunist. She had seen too many women cling to a child like the last piece of wreckage in the water. And though she didn't judge them, she knew she couldn't survive becoming one of them in his eyes, because if he helped her because of the baby, then that kindness would be something she owed, not something she deserved, and a debt like that was heavier than hunger itself. She would rather be thrown back onto the street with her dignity intact than be kept as an obligation. And there was another, deeper layer of fear she didn't dare name clearly, that she didn't know what a man in Tobias's world would do when he learned he had a child with a maid, whether he would want to keep it, or want it gone, or want to keep the baby and push her aside. And in all those possibilities there was not a single one that she, a woman with no name and no power, could fight. So she chose the only safe path left, to stand on her own feet, clear her name with the weapon she trusted, and leave this house with her head held high, before her belly grew too large to hide. When Tobias Quast returned to the room in the afternoon, after finishing the business of his morning, Marlowe was already standing there waiting, and before he could say anything, she spoke first, her voice calm and clear, the voice of someone who had already put her thoughts in order. She repeated the request she had made that morning, saying that she wanted to review all the expense ledgers she had once been responsible for, along with the larger ledgers they flowed into, and she asked him to give her time and a quiet place to do it. She told him she wasn't asking for his trust, because trust was something that had to be earned, not begged for. She was only asking for the chance to let the numbers speak for themselves. And if they failed to prove what she said, then he could do with her whatever he wished. Tobias looked at her for a long while with the eyes of a man weighing a gamble, and Marlowe knew she had planted exactly the seed she needed to plant in his mind, not pity, but curiosity. The dangerous curiosity of a powerful man beginning to suspect that someone was stealing right beneath his nose. She saw it when his eyes narrowed slightly, when he asked her, in a slow voice, whether she was sure she wanted to follow this road all the way to the end, because once he opened those ledgers to her, there would be no turning back, and if she found what she claimed she would find, it wouldn't only threaten the person who had harmed her, it could threaten her life as well. Marlowe answered that her life had been in danger from the moment someone slipped that earring into her drawer, that she had nothing left to lose that she had not already lost, and that she would rather die knowing the truth than live branded as a thief. That sentence, and the firmness inside it, seemed to be the final thing that tipped the scale in his mind. Tobias gave a single nod and said he agreed. He would give her 3 days and supervised access to the expense ledgers, but he added, his gaze locked tightly on hers, that if this was a trick meant to buy time or build a story to blame an innocent person, then she would wish she had never returned to this garden. Then he turned and walked toward the door, and before closing it, he paused for one beat, not turning his head, only saying quietly that he had never met a maid who spoke about ledgers the way she did, and he wasn't sure whether that meant he should trust her more, or guard himself against her more. The door closed, and Marlowe stood alone, her heart pounding, understanding that she had just won the first move, but had also pushed herself into a game whose dark pieces she could not yet fully see, and her hand returned once more to her belly, where her greatest secret still lay quiet, safe, and unknown to anyone. The next morning, Marlowe was led into a small study on the ground floor, where Odette had arranged for thick stacks of ledgers, bundles of invoices clipped inside leather folders, and an old computer containing electronic expense spreadsheets to be brought in, all placed beneath the silent watch of a guard standing outside the door under Tobias's orders. This guard was Frankie Doyle, Tobias's most loyal driver and personal bodyguard, a man with a time-worn face who had protected the Ferraro family for over 15 years. Before closing the study door, Frankie gave Marlowe a brief, respectful nod, ensuring she felt secure enough to do her work. With a slight sense of relief, Marlowe took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves to reveal the two familiar ink-stained fingers, and sat down before that heap of papers with the air of a craftsman finally returned to the proper tools of her trade. To her, those columns of numbers were not work but shelter, the one language in the world that had never lied to her, and the moment her finger slid down the first page, every noise inside her head, the fear, her belly, the man upstairs, all of it receded and made room for a sharp, cold focus. She worked through the entire morning without resting her hands, not comparing things at random, but following the exact discrepancies she had already memorized. And this time she had not only her own staff ledger, but the larger ledgers as well, the main currents through which the family's money flowed. She began pulling at each small thread, and every thread led back to the same piece of cloth. The first thing she traced was a series of payments to a freight company called Tallman Freight, regular monthly expenses for moving goods through the port, each payment not large enough to attract attention on its own, but when added together, enough to become a significant sum. Marlowe did the thing that clearly no one had bothered to do. She matched the dates of the shipments listed on the invoices against the actual warehouse entry and exit logs, and she discovered something that sent a chill down her spine, that many of those fully paid shipments had never existed at all. There were days when Tallman Freight claimed to have delivered 3 truckloads, yet the warehouse log was completely blank, not one receiving signature, not one inventory movement. She kept tracing and found that the company had only been registered 2 years earlier, had no website, no history, and that the address listed on its paperwork was a mailbox at a postal center, not an actual freight yard. It was a shell company, a tap inserted into the family's bloodstream to drain money out beneath the cover of shipments that had never happened, and the person who approved every payment to it, the signature at the bottom of every disbursement slip, was none other than Wesley Dorn. Marlowe sat still for a while before that discovery, her heart pounding, because she knew she had just touched the very artery whose scent she had only caught 3 weeks earlier, and now it was appearing in black and white beneath the lamp. She recorded every number, every date, every inconsistency with painstaking care, arranging them into a chain that anyone would have to be able to read. No accounting skill required, only the ability to read. That afternoon, Tobias came in, and he said nothing, only pulled out a chair and sat across from her on the other side of the table, and Marlowe offered no preamble. She turned the papers toward him and began presenting them, her voice calm, her finger pointing to each line. Leading him through the maze she had untangled into a straight path. She showed him the shipment that had been paid for, but had never arrived, then the second, then the third. She showed him the shell company with the mailbox address. She showed him Wesley's signature repeated again and again, at the bottom of every slip, and she did all of it without once making an accusation aloud. She simply let the numbers speak for themselves, exactly as she had promised. Tobias bent over the papers, and Marlowe watched his face shift from polite skepticism into true, strained attention, watched his jaw tighten when he realized that what lay before him wasn't the imagined tale of a maid, but a real breach that had been quietly bleeding the family treasury, for months, right beneath his nose. He lifted his eyes to her, and for the first time there was no cold guardedness in them, but something else, a reluctant respect mixed with astonishment, because the man used to measuring every person around him had just realized how deeply he had underestimated this woman. He asked her how she had seen what an entire professional accounting machine had failed to see, and Marlowe answered, not arrogantly but honestly, that people didn't see because they didn't want to see, while she had nothing to lose, so she looked straight at it. In that moment, their heads bent over the same page beneath the yellow light. An unexpected closeness rose between them, not loud emotion, but the quiet understanding of two minds that had finally met a worthy match, and both of them felt it, and both of them quickly looked away. But Tobias, as he gathered up the papers, said something that made Marlowe go still, that Wesley Dorn, no matter how greedy he might be, was only an accountant, and an accountant couldn't set up an entire shell company by himself and keep it running for 2 years without someone backing him. So the real question wasn't whether Wesley had taken the money, but who he was taking it for. Tobias's question, who he was taking it for, drove itself into Marlowe's mind like a nail and refused to come loose. And that night, when the house had gone to sleep and the guard outside her door had changed shifts to a man more careless than the last, She found her way back to the study and opened the ledgers again, this time not looking for where the money had gone, but where the money had flowed back to. She followed the trail of funds siphoned out through Tallman Freight, and she realized it had not disappeared into one man's pocket in the clumsy way of a greedy fool, but had been washed through a chain of sophisticated steps, transformed into small investments, intermediary accounts, shell companies linked one after another like connected rooms inside a maze, designed by a colder and far more patient mind than Wesley's. Marlowe followed that trail for hours, and at the final point she could reach, before the paths became too sealed for someone, without bank access, to go any farther, she found a name that appeared briefly on an authorization document that should never have slipped into this file at all, a tiny mistake by someone who had grown too confident. The name was Cassius Ferraro. Marlowe sat frozen when she read it, because she knew that name, the whole mansion knew it. Cassius was Tobias's cousin, the family consigliere, the right-hand Tobias trusted in every negotiation, the elegant man with the pleasant smile who came and went through this house as if it were his own. And in that moment, she understood that she had just uncovered something 100 times more dangerous than theft, because Wesley was only the tap, while Cassius was the hand controlling that tap, and a man in Cassius's position wouldn't drain the family merely to enrich himself. He would do it for a far greater purpose. The deeper she dug that night, the more clearly the picture emerged, and the more terrifying it became. The money being siphoned away had not simply vanished. Part of it had been used to build what Marlowe, with the eyes of someone who knew how to read ledgers, recognized as a parallel slush fund, a private resource beyond Tobias's control, large enough to buy loyalty, large enough to feed a hidden force inside the family itself. But what truly chilled her was a set of documents she found copied and hidden carefully inside a locked drawer that Odette had subtly provided the master key for, allowing her to bypass the lock and crack the hidden passcode based on Cassius's birth date, another act of arrogance from a man who believed no one would be smart enough to get this far. Inside that file were notes, copies of transactions, timelines arranged with care, not to conceal the family's crimes, but to expose them, compiled exactly the way a person would prepare evidence for surrender. Marlowe wasn't a lawyer, but she had read enough news to understand what she was looking at. This was a file being built to hand over to the federal authorities, to the FBI, a loaded gun prepared so that one day it could be aimed straight at Tobias Ferraro. Cassius didn't only want to steal money, he wanted the throne itself, and the cruelty of his plan was that it walked on 2 legs at once, one leg quietly draining Tobias's financial strength in order to weaken him, the other gathering evidence so that when the moment came, he could push him into prison or into the grave and calmly take over a family already cleared for him. Marlowe sat in the darkness of the study, her hands trembling as she folded the file back exactly the way she had found it, and a fear unlike any she had ever known settled over her, entirely different from the fear of being fired or falsely accused. This was the fear of someone who had accidentally stepped into the middle of a war for a throne, where both sides would be willing to crush anyone who stood in the way. She understood at once that she couldn't run to Tobias right now and shout Cassius's name, because she had nothing in her hands except numbers and a name glimpsed on paper, and the word of a maid accused of theft accusing the kingpin's most trusted right hand would sound like the desperate gamble of a cornered woman trying to drag someone else down into the mud with her. Worse, if word reached Cassius that a maid was following his trail, then she and the small life inside her would vanish from this world as smoothly as a minor discrepancy erased from a ledger, with no one investigating and no one remembering. So Marlowe did the hardest thing for someone who had just found the truth. She stayed silent. She carefully put everything back exactly where it belonged, erased every sign that she had been there, and returned to her room with her heart pounding and a bitter decision settling inside her, that she would have to gather enough evidence for no one to deny before she opened her mouth. And until then she would have to live in the middle of the tiger's den, smiling at people she now knew were devils, and holding close not one secret but 2, each one powerful enough to kill her. Wesley Dorn was not the kind of man to sit still and wait, and he was shrewd enough to smell danger from the day. Tobias began letting the maid touch the ledgers. 3 days after the night Marlowe traced that dangerous name. As she was making her way back from the study through a rear corridor few people used, Wesley stopped her and this time he no longer hid the threat beneath a layer of politeness. He blocked her path, his broad body cutting off the light, and said in a low voice that a smart girl ought to know when to stop being smart, that those ledgers had buried people far wiser than she was, and that it would be a shame if another missing item in this house were once again found in her possession. Only next time the thing lost wouldn't be an earring. He stepped closer, one hand lifting as if he were about to seize her arm, and Marlowe backed up until her spine touched the wall, her heart pounding hard, but her chin still raised, refusing to show him the fear he wanted to see. It was then that Tobias's voice sounded from the end of the hallway, low and cold as a blade drawn from its sheath, asking Wesley what he was doing in this part of the house at this hour. Wesley froze, his expression changing at once, and he stammered some explanation about looking for files, but Tobias had already stepped forward, placing himself between the accountant and the woman, and though he didn't raise his voice, didn't make any specific threat, the way he looked at Wesley was enough to make the large man break into a sweat and retreat, mumbling an apology before disappearing as quickly as he could. Once he was gone, Tobias turned to Marlowe, and for a moment the cold kingpin in him softened into something almost like concern. He asked if she was all right, his eyes moving quickly over her as if checking whether she had been hurt. Marlowe straightened, brushed off her sleeve, and said in a voice so calm it was almost cold that she was fine, that she had faced men far more frightening than Wesley Dorn, and that she didn't need anyone to shield her. That sentence, that almost ungrateful stubbornness, made Tobias pause and frown, because he wasn't used to anyone brushing aside his protection as if it were an inconvenience. He said, his voice edged with irritation, that she had just been cornered and threatened by a man twice her size, and that surely a thank you shouldn't be too difficult. Marlowe looked straight at him and answered that she would thank him if he helped her because she deserved to be helped, not because she was some fragile creature in need of pity, and that life had taught her one thing: kindness given to the weak always came with an invisible chain, and she was far too tired of chains. Tobias stood silent, watching her for a long while after that, and something shifted in his eyes, no longer annoyance but a deeper curiosity, mingled with something he himself didn't want to name, because the woman standing before him, exhausted, pregnant, with not an inch of power in her hands, had just refused the protection of the most powerful man in Providence, with a pride that even the strongest men in his world wouldn't dare show in front of him. He said, his voice softer now, that he wasn't helping her out of pity. He was helping because in his house no one was allowed to threaten another person behind his back. That was his matter, not hers, and that meant she owed him nothing. Those words, the way he gave her a way out that allowed her to keep her pride, instead of forcing her to bow her head, made Marlowe go still, and for the first time she couldn't find a sharp reply. The two of them stood there in the empty hallway, closer than necessary, and in that silence there was a tension entirely different from the fear that had just passed, a dangerous warmth drawing two people who should have remained far apart closer together, calling back something both of them were trying to bury in different ways. Marlowe felt it, and she hated herself for feeling it, hated the way her heart betrayed her reason. Right in front of the man who had once looked at her as if looking through glass, the man whose greatest secret she was carrying, along with another secret deadly enough to destroy them both. She was the one who stepped back first, breaking the moment, saying quietly that she needed to return to her room and rest, and she turned away before his eyes could hold her there. But once she reached her room and leaned back against the closed door, Marlowe pressed a hand to her chest to calm her heartbeat, and she realized with a new kind of terror that the most dangerous enemy in this house might not be Wesley, or even Cassius, but the part of her heart that still wanted to believe in the man upstairs. After Tobias caught him in the hallway, Wesley Dorn did exactly what a frightened lackey always does. He ran to report to his master, and so, only 2 days later, Cassius Ferraro appeared at the mansion with the easy leisure of a man dropping in on family, his tailored suit fitting perfectly, his smile warm, a box of almond pastries from the Italian bakery Silvio loved in his hand, as if his only concern were the health of his recovering uncle. Marlowe saw him from a distance through the doorway, and felt her whole body go cold, because this was the first time she had looked at the man since learning who he really was. And the most terrifying thing was that he didn't look like a devil at all. He looked like the kindest man in the house. She tried to avoid him all morning, but in the early afternoon, while she was in the library arranging several ledgers, the door opened and Cassius stepped in alone, closing it behind him with a motion so gentle that Marlowe didn't realize she had just been shut inside the room with him until the latch gave a soft click. He didn't threaten her, and that was exactly what made him many times more frightening than Wesley. He smiled and introduced himself with courtesy, as though she were an honored guest and not a servant, praising his dear Tobias for having such an eye for people, keeping a girl this intelligent when everyone else believed she was a thief. He walked along the bookshelves, his fingers sliding over the spines of old volumes, and as he moved, he spoke in a warm, melodic voice, asking about where she came from, about the education she had left unfinished, about the father who had lost everything to debt. And Marlowe felt a chill as she realized how thoroughly he had looked into her. Every question that sounded casual was a needle testing what she knew and how great a threat she might be. He said, still wearing that smile, that he had heard she had a gift for numbers, a rare and precious talent. But then he stopped, turned to look straight at her, and though his voice remained sweet, his eyes had gone cold. He said that such a talent was like a sharp knife. It was useful only as long as the person holding it knew what should be cut, but if it was swung carelessly, sooner or later it would slice into its owner's hand. Marlowe understood exactly what he was saying, and she chose the only safe response. She played the part of an honest maid, saying that she was only trying to prove she wasn't a thief, so she could reclaim her dignity and keep her job, that she didn't care about anything larger than that the numbers she read were merely household expenses, and that she certainly wasn't qualified to understand the family's larger business affairs. She lowered her face, acted timid, folded herself into the harmless image she knew he wanted to see, and prayed he would believe it. Cassius watched her for a long while, the look of a man weighing how much of that testimony was true, and Marlowe felt as though he were reading every pulse beating in her throat. Then he gave a soft laugh, an agreeable sound, and said he was very glad to hear that, because he hated to see a talented young woman entangled in troubles that weren't hers, troubles that, in a family like theirs, sometimes ended very sadly. He came closer to her, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne, and he bent to pick up a ledger she had dropped, because her hand had trembled slightly, returning it to her with both hands, like a gentlemanly gesture. And as he handed it over, he said softly, almost in a whisper, that this house was large and old, with many staircases, many balconies, many places where a tired and pregnant woman might lose her footing if she wasn't careful, and that he sincerely hoped she would always be very careful, because it would break his heart if anything happened to her or to the baby. Those words made the blood in Marlowe's body seem to freeze, not only because of the threat wrapped in velvet, but because he knew about the pregnancy. He knew, and he had just made sure she understood that he knew. She lifted her eyes to him, forcing her face to stay calm, and he only smiled once more. A perfect smile that never touched his eyes, then turned away, opened the latch, and before stepping out, glanced back to wish her a pleasant afternoon, in a voice as warm as if they had just shared a friendly conversation. When the door closed behind him, Marlowe had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright, one hand wrapping around her belly in an instinctive gesture of protection, and she understood that the game had changed completely. Her enemy now knew she was a threat, knew her most fatal weakness, and he had struck first with a move so polite it was chilling, showing her that inside this house, he could reach her whenever he wanted. The truth came to Tobias not through a confession, but through a piece of paper, and that made it cut even deeper. Odette, worried about Marlowe's health after several days of seeing her pale and eating erratically, had quietly invited a doctor she trusted to examine her, and the prenatal file with the due date written clearly had been left in the study for Odette to put away. Tobias, stepping into room by chance to look for another document, saw it, and his eyes, those eyes accustomed to reading every number in search of the truth people wanted to hide, automatically did the calculation he had been avoiding for days. The due date minus 9 months. The number appeared coldly and undeniably, pointing straight back to that winter night when his father collapsed, the night he had drunk himself into a stupor and found a little warmth in a person he should never have found it in, the night he had ordered his own memory to erase. He stood motionless for a long time with the paper in his hand, and inside his chest rose a chaos of emotions that a man like him had no ready compartment to contain. Shock, then cold certainty, then anger flaring so fast that even he was startled by it. And beneath all of it, deepest and hardest to admit, was a sharp ache when he realized that his child had been growing for 4 months right beside him without his knowing, that the woman carrying it had sat across from him through page after page of ledgers, had been thrown into the cold garden at night by an order he himself had signed, had collapsed out there with his own blood inside her body, and she had chosen silence. He went looking for her at once, the paper still in his hand, and he found Marlowe in the guest room where she was staying, and she only had to look at his face, at the file in his hand, to understand that the wall she had built to protect herself had just fallen apart. Tobias closed the door, and he didn't shout. His voice was low and tight, like a cord about to snap, as he lifted the paper and asked her if this was the truth, if the baby was his. Marlowe stood, her face paling, but she didn't lower her head, didn't evade him. She said in a soft but clear voice that yes, it was his child. And that honesty, that admission without a single plea attached to it, seemed to make his anger burn even hotter, because he stepped toward her and asked how long she had planned to hide it from him, whether she had sat across from him for all these days, had let him bring her into his house, feed her, shelter her, open the ledgers to her, without once intending to tell him that he was going to be a father. He said he was a man who knew everything that happened in his territory, and yet a woman had been living under his roof and hiding from him the greatest thing one person could hide from another. And in his voice, there was both the fury of a man who had been outmaneuvered and the hurt of someone who had just discovered he'd been shut out of his own life. Marlowe let him finish, and when he stopped, breathing hard, she finally spoke, and her voice didn't tremble. She asked him in return whether, if she had told him, he would have believed her, or whether he would have immediately thought she was a clever servant girl, trying to cling to her master's blood to change her fate. She said she had lived long enough at the very bottom of society to know exactly how the world looked at a woman like her, when she held out a child in the name of a powerful man, and she told him, looking straight into his eyes, that she would rather starve in the street than let him look at her with the gaze she was certain he would have used. The gaze of a man who thought he was being shaken down for money. Those words struck somewhere inside him, because he fell silent, and Marlowe went on, her voice lowering but not softening, saying that on the morning 4 months ago, he had looked at her as though looking through glass, and told her that night had been a mistake, never to be mentioned again, and she had obeyed. She had put it away, both that night and what came from it, and she had never meant to take anything from him, not even this truth. She had only wanted to clear her name, leave quietly, and give birth alone the way so many other women had done. The two of them stood facing each other in the room, and between them lay the paper, 4 months of silence, and a night no one had been allowed to mention, while the air grew thick with all the things left unsaid. Tobias looked at her, the anger in his eyes slowly giving way to a confusion he was not used to enduring, because every reason she gave was true, every one of them a brick he had laid himself with his own coldness, and he couldn't blame her for building a wall when he had been the first one to build it. But he also couldn't immediately forgive the silence that had taken from him the right to know, and so he did what a man who didn't know how to handle his own heart still did. He turned his back and walked to the door, paused for a beat at the threshold, and said in a hoarse voice that he needed time, then walked away, leaving Marlowe standing alone in the middle of the room, with her hand pressed to her belly, and the feeling that everything she had tried to hold had just slipped from her grasp. While beyond that door, the most powerful man in Providence did not know, for the first time in many years, what he was supposed to do next. For the next 2 days, Tobias did not come to see her, and that silence did what shouted words never could. It carved into Marlowe an old ache of humiliation she had thought had long since gone numb. She understood that silence in the only way a person in her position could understand it, that he was weighing how to handle her, calculating how much a pregnant maid was worth, and how much trouble she might cause, and every hour that passed in that waiting only confirmed what she had always believed about her place in the world of people like him. So on the 3rd day, when Tobias finally returned to her room, with his face calmer than before, and began by saying that he had thought things through and wanted to arrange everything for her and the baby, that he wanted her to stay in the mansion and wanted to provide for her fully. Instead of feeling relief, something inside Marlowe broke open. What she heard in his words was not affection but arrangement, the way a powerful man solved an unexpected problem by throwing money and comfort at it, and that very kindness shaped like a transaction hurt her more than coldness ever had. She stood, and the words she had held back for 4 months, for an entire lifetime, finally poured out. She told him she did not need to be arranged, that she was not a line item in his ledger that needed to be balanced neatly. She was a human being. She asked him whether he knew what it felt like to be looked at like an object, what it felt like to stand in a room and know with certainty that, to the people inside it, you were worth only the work you could perform, what it felt like for a man to sit with you through one long night, sharing the deepest wounds he carried, and then in the morning look through you as though you had never existed, simply because you wore a servant's uniform. Her voice broke, but she did not stop. She said she had not hidden the baby from him out of calculation. She had hidden it because she knew the moment he found out, she would forever cease to be Marlowe in his eyes, and would only ever be the maid who had accidentally become pregnant by her master. A label she would never be able to remove, and she would rather take her child far away than let it grow up in a house where its mother was treated like a mistake that needed to be provided for so she would stay quiet. She said she had proved she was not a thief, or nearly had, and once everything came to light, she would leave. She would raise her child herself, with her own hands and her own mind, just as she had kept herself alive all these years, and she did not need a single cent from the Ferraro family to do it. Tobias stood there listening as she emptied herself of everything, and the strange thing was that the man who always had an answer for every situation, a move for every board, stood silent, because for the first time in his life he was facing a problem for which his power was completely useless. He couldn't order her to trust him, couldn't buy her respect, couldn't threaten her into love, and every tool he possessed, money, strength, intimidation, became absurd in front of a woman who was simply demanding to be seen as a human being. He opened his mouth to say he did not think of her that way, but the moment the words left him, he heard how weak they were, because he knew that over the past 4 months he had treated her exactly as she said. He had looked through her, had signed the order to throw her out, without even bothering to look at her face, and he couldn't erase those things with a single correction. That helplessness etched itself across his face, and Marlowe saw it, but she was too hurt and too proud to soften. She told him, in a voice that had grown calm again, but colder than when she had been shouting, that she thanked him for giving her a place to sleep and a chance to clear her name, and she would repay that by exposing the person stealing from him. But after that she asked him to let her go, and not turn the baby into a chain binding her to him, because if he did that, then he would be no different from the whole world that had taught her people like her were never allowed to have dignity. When she finished, she turned away, and Tobias, who had never let anyone have the final word in any room, stood there looking at her back, his hand tightening and then releasing, and he walked out with a strange, bitter feeling growing in his chest, the feeling of a man who had just realized that the only thing he truly wanted to keep might be the one thing his power could not hold, and that the fracture between them had not been created by her, but by his own cold hand. Laid down on a winter morning, he had believed he had forgotten. That night, Tobias went to his father's room, not exactly because he needed advice, but because in one of the rare moments of confusion in his life, he didn't know where else to go. And Silvio Ferraro, though his health had weakened greatly after the stroke, was still the only person in the world beside whom Tobias could sit without keeping his armor on. The old man sat in an armchair beside the fireplace, a blanket spread over his knees, and he looked at his son as he came in with eyes that were still sharp despite the trembling of his body, the eyes of a man who had ruled an entire underworld empire for 40 years and learned to read people before they even opened their mouths. He asked Tobias what was tormenting him, and Tobias, after a long silence, told his father not about the baby, because he still wasn't ready to say that aloud, but about the numbers, about the shell company, about the stream of money being drained away, and finally, lowering his voice, about the name the maid had traced at the end of that path, the name Cassius. Silvio went very still for a long time after hearing his nephew's name, and what appeared on the old man's face was not surprise, but a deep and weary sorrow. the sorrow of someone who had been waiting for bad news for many years and was only now receiving it. He told Tobias to sit down, and he told his son a story Tobias had never heard in full, the story of Cassius's father, Silvio's younger brother, a man who had died young in an internal purge back when the family was still fragile, and of what had happened afterward. When Cassius's father died, the family was in danger, and the people in power at the time made a cold decision. They cut ties with the dead man's widow and little son, pushing them outside, in order to preserve the safety and dignity of the main bloodline, leaving mother and child to scrape by in poverty on the edge of the city, while the family slowly revived and grew rich. Silvio confessed, his voice heavy, that back then he had been young and ambitious, and had not been brave enough to stand against that decision, that he had stood by and watched his own nephew be abandoned, while telling himself it was necessary, and that the boy Cassius had grown up inside that rejection, watching his cousins live in the velvet comfort of a name that should have partly belonged to him too, and learning very early that in this family blood would not save anyone, only power would. He said that only many years later, when Cassius was grown and had shown himself to be extraordinarily intelligent, did the family bring him back and give him the position of consigliere. But they had brought home a man whose inside had long since gone cold, a man who smiled and served but never forgot that he had once been thrown outside the gate like a burden. Tobias sat listening, and he realized with a chill down his spine that Cassius's story and his own were two sides of the same coin, both forged by a moment of abandonment, both carrying the wound of a door closed at the very moment it should have opened. Yet from that same wound they had grown into two opposite men. He, standing beside Rosalind's body on the cold sidewalk, had sworn never to let anyone be left behind again, had turned pain into a vow of protection. Cassius, abandoned by the very family that should have claimed him, had sworn something else, that he would never again allow himself to be powerless, had turned pain into a cold hunger for power, and a smoldering grudge waiting for the day it could reclaim everything that had been taken. Silvio looked at his son and said, his voice trembling, that he was not telling this story to excuse Cassius, because what his nephew was doing was an unforgivable betrayal, but so Tobias would understand that the devil in their house had not been born from nothing. He had been raised by the family's own cruelty, by a door all of them, including Silvio himself, had helped close many years ago. He took his son's hand in his own trembling one and said that the Ferraro family had once planted the seed of abandonment and was now harvesting its bitter fruit, and he prayed that, when the moment came for Tobias to face Cassius, he would be wise enough to remember that every great crime began with a person who had been denied, and that the cycle would go on forever unless someone was strong enough to choose to stop it. Tobias left his father's room with a new weight in his heart, because now his enemy was no longer a simple devil he could neatly destroy, but a distorted mirror reflecting himself back at him, and he knew that no matter how it ended, the night he had to face Cassius would not only be a battle for the family, but a battle with his own shadow inside a man who, if fate had turned only a little differently, could have been him. After Cassius's velvet-wrapped threat, Marlowe's first reaction was the oldest instinct of the powerless, to run, to pack the old suitcase and disappear from Providence, before this house swallowed both her and her child whole. But that night, as she sat in the dark with her hand resting on her belly and felt, for the first time, a faint little flutter from within, a tiny movement like a butterfly's wing, something inside her hardened and decided she wouldn't run anymore. She thought about where running would lead, a pregnant woman with no money and no support, hiding from a man who had an entire slush fund and a network of men at his command, and she understood that running would only mean dying slowly in fear, instead of dying quickly, that as long as Cassius believed she was a threat, he would find her anywhere she tried to hide. But deeper than that calculation of survival was something else, a ripened fury she had spent her whole life bowing her head and never allowing herself to feel in full. She had been framed, threatened, treated like a number that could be erased, and now inside her was a small life she swore would not grow up in a world where men like Cassius always won, and people like her were always forced to stay silent and disappear. She decided to stay and fight, not for Tobias, because what lay between her and him was still an unhealed fracture, but for her child, for the dignity she had bled to keep, and for something she was surprised to realize she still believed in, justice. but she was wise enough to know she couldn't fight alone, and the only person in this house her instincts told her she could trust was Odette, the woman who had quietly brought her ginger tea and had seen the pregnancy even before Marlowe had managed to hide it. The next morning, Marlowe went to Odette, and she had thought very carefully about how much she should say, but in the end she chose to gamble on honesty. She told the head housekeeper about the numbers, about the shell company, and she watched the woman's face closely when she mentioned that the money trail led to someone very high within the family. And what she saw on Odette's face was not disbelief but a dark confirmation, as though the older woman had suspected something for a long time, without having the proof to give it a name. Odette sat down, lowering for the first time the stern mask of a housekeeper, and she told Marlowe that she had served this house for 30 years, had watched Cassius from the day he was brought back, and had never trusted that man's smile. She had seen too many loyal servants suddenly reassigned or disappear, in ways no one could explain whenever they happened to learn too much. She said she did not have Marlowe's head for reading numbers, but she had something Marlowe did not have: keys, the trust accumulated over 30 years, and the right to move through every corner of the house without anyone bothering to notice an old housekeeper. And so a silent alliance formed between two women the whole family treated as invisible, the young one with the mind that could read the truth hidden inside numbers, the old one with the feet and ears that could reach the places where that truth was hidden. In the days that followed, they worked together with care, measured down to each breath. Odette somehow gained access to places Marlowe could not reach, bringing back copies of invoices, scraps of correspondence, Cassius and Wesley's schedules of coming and going, while Marlowe sat night after night beneath the lamp, piecing everything together into a picture that grew more complete and undeniable with every passing hour. She was no longer collecting evidence only to clear her own name. She was now building a file strong enough to strip Cassius bare before the entire family, and she did it with the cold precision of someone who knew that even one small mistake could make both her and her child pay with their lives. She copied everything into 2 sets, hiding one set in a place even Odette did not know, in case something happened to her and the truth still needed a way to survive. Life in the mansion now felt to Marlowe like a wire pulled tight enough to sing. At every meal, she had to sit at the same table as the man who had threatened to kill her child and smile as though nothing had happened. Every time she passed a staircase, she remembered what he had said about places where someone might lose her footing, and she learned never to walk alone, never to stand near a railing, never to reveal that beneath the resigned appearance of a maid was a woman tightening the noose around her enemy's throat night after night. And in all that tension, something unexpected began to grow inside Marlowe. It was no longer the fear of a victim, but the dangerous calm of a person who had chosen where she would stand. She was no longer the woman who had collapsed asleep in the garden, waiting for someone else's mercy. She had become the hunter, and her prey still did not know that the creature he believed was the most trembling rabbit in the house was in fact quietly digging the grave that would bury him. Cassius, with the instinct of a long-practiced predator, sensed the noose tightening around his neck before it ever touched his skin, and instead of waiting to be exposed, he decided to strike first with a move so cruel and so intelligent that even the truth itself was nearly left choking. One evening, without warning, he summoned a meeting of the family council, the men who headed the organization's different branches, in the grand dining room behind closed oak doors, and Marlowe was brought into the middle of that room by 2 guards like a defendant being led before a court. She stood there beneath the chandelier, surrounded by the cold faces seated around the long table, and at the head of the table was Tobias, his expression unreadable, while beside him, standing at ease with the confidence of a man certain of victory, was Cassius. He began in a calm voice filled with false regret, telling the council that he had been forced to gather everyone because he had discovered a serious danger creeping through this very house. And then he turned and pointed at Marlowe, declaring that the maid his dear Tobias had so generously kept was, in truth, not an innocent girl falsely accused, but a federal plant sent in to collect evidence against the Ferraro family. The entire room seemed to reel from that accusation, and Cassius, like a man who had prepared every card in advance, began laying out his carefully staged evidence. He produced copies of the family's confidential documents that had been found hidden in Marlowe's room, the very documents she had secretly copied in order to expose him, now twisted by him into proof that she was smuggling information out. He presented Wesley Dorn's statement, with Wesley now standing on his side, confirming that the maid had repeatedly asked about sensitive family business far beyond her duties. He even held out a note supposedly recording calls made to a number connected to a federal office, a detail completely fabricated but planted in exactly the right place so that no one would have time to verify it. And then he delivered the cruelest blow. In a low, sorrowful voice, he said that she was also pregnant, and that no one could know for certain how far that pregnancy was part of the infiltration plan, an ambiguous sentence released only to seed suspicion and disgust in everyone's mind, to turn Marlowe from a human being into a conspiracy with hands and feet. The air in the room thickened with hostility, the men around the table looking at Marlowe with the eyes of those who had already passed judgment, and she stood there alone inside the circle, with no lawyer, no witness, no one to defend her, facing a sentence that in this world carried only one punishment for the crime of being an informant: death. She saw the danger written clearly across every face, and she understood that Cassius had calculated this move perfectly. He had taken her own weapon, the evidence she had gathered, and turned it into the rope around her neck. He had reversed the board so quickly and so ruthlessly that the truth now looked exactly like a lie. She turned her eyes toward Tobias, searching for something on his face, and what she saw made her heart tighten, because he wasn't looking at her with trust, but with a cold, measuring scrutiny, the expression of a man reconsidering everything, and she realized that in this moment, standing before those skillfully staged pieces of evidence, even the man whose child she carried had to ask himself whether everything she had shown him might only be the perfect performance of a professional spy. Cassius, reading the hesitation on his cousin's face, pressed harder, telling Tobias in the voice of a concerned brother that Tobias's softness toward this girl had placed the entire family in danger, that it was time to act decisively for everyone's safety, and he demanded that the council vote to decide the fate of the person he called the snake inside the house. Murmurs of agreement began rising around the table, the hands of several men already resting on the polished wood as if ready to vote, and Marlowe felt the entire room closing around her like a coffin, every exit sealed, every word she might speak ready to be bent into one more piece of evidence against her. She placed one hand on her belly, drew a deep breath in the suffocating air of that underground trial, and understood that she had only one chance left to speak, one fragile moment before the door of fate slammed shut, and if she used it to beg or deny the charge in the ordinary way, she would die. So she had to do the one thing no one in that room, not even Cassius, was expecting. Marlowe didn't kneel, didn't cry, didn't utter a single plea of innocence, and it was precisely that unnatural calm that made the murmurs around the table falter, because an exposed spy should have panicked, while this woman stood straight with her head held high, as though she were the one holding something in her hands. She spoke, her voice clear and steady as it carried across the perfectly silent room, saying that she wouldn't waste the gentleman's valuable time denying an accusation, because words against words meant nothing. Instead, she asked to be allowed to do exactly what she'd done all her life, which was to let the numbers speak, and she requested that the family ledgers be brought into this room, right now, in front of everyone. Cassius objected at once, saying this was only a desperate person's trick to buy time, but that very haste to stop her made several faces around the table tighten in faint suspicion, and Tobias, after looking at her for a long moment, lifted his hand and signaled for the ledgers to be brought in, his cold voice saying that if she wanted to dig her own grave with numbers, he'd give her the shovel. When the ledgers were placed on the table, Marlowe stepped forward, and the moment her hand touched them, the trembling inside her vanished completely, giving way to the sharp calm of a craftswoman returned to her proper tools. She opened the ledger and began, not saying one word about herself, only leading the entire council along the path of the money, slowly, clearly, in a language so simple that even men who'd never read a page of accounting in their lives had to nod as understanding began to settle in. She showed them Tallman freight, then showed them shipments that had been paid for in full while the warehouse logs remained empty. She matched each date before their eyes, one phantom shipment, then two, then three, and she asked the whole room one simple question. What exactly was a freight company being paid to do if it never delivered freight? Then she turned to the approval signatures at the bottom of each disbursement slip, Wesley Dorn's signature. And Wesley began to sweat, but Marlowe didn't stop there. She lifted her eyes and looked straight at Cassius, saying that a salaried accountant couldn't create a shell company by himself and launder millions of dollars through it for 2 years without someone protecting him. And then she began following the money flowing out of that shell company, through intermediary accounts, through dummy corporations until it stopped before one name. She didn't say the name herself. She did something far smarter. She simply placed the authorization document bearing Cassius's signature on the table, right beside the payment slips, and let the entire council read it for themselves, connect the points for themselves, see for themselves the true hand behind it all. The room went dead still, and in that silence, Marlowe delivered the final blow. She said Cassius had accused her of being a spy feeding documents to the federal authorities, but the very documents supposedly used as evidence against her, when read closely, were actually a carefully compiled file on every operation of the family, arranged neatly in exactly the way a person preparing to hand evidence to prosecutors would arrange it. And she asked the counsel, her voice ringing out slowly and clearly, where a maid, who'd been in the house less than 1 year, could have gotten access to the most confidential information at the highest levels of the organization in order to compile such a file, or whether it had to be the work of someone sitting in the position of consigliere, the only person in the house with every key. She said the person truly working with the federal authorities wasn't the one pushed into the middle of this room as a sacrifice, but the one who'd staged the entire performance so that one arrow would strike 2 targets, destroying the person who'd discovered him while also leaving a ready-made scapegoat to blame if his betrayal was ever exposed. Now the eyes of the entire council had shifted to Cassius, and they were no longer the condemning eyes that had been fixed on her, but a cold suspicion fixed on him. The men who'd been nodding along with him only moments earlier now sat straighter, their hands leaving the tabletop. Cassius still tried to keep his smile, but it had cracked at the corners of his mouth, and he loudly called everything she'd just presented the twisted argument of a clever, cornered woman, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence, and Tobias, seated at the head of the table, finally spoke, his voice quiet yet cutting through the room like a blade. He said there was one very simple way to know who was telling the truth, and that was to open the account of that shell company and see whose pocket the money had flowed into, and he looked straight at Cassius as he asked whether his cousin was willing to let everything be brought into the light. Tobias's question about bringing the account into the light hung suspended in the air, and every eye in the room turned toward Cassius. But it was Wesley Dorn who broke first, because the accountant was shrewd enough to understand at once what fear had just laid bare before him, that if that account was opened, the signature on every disbursement slip would be his, that in this entire performance he was the one placed in the most exposed position, and that the moment everything collapsed, Cassius would retreat safely into the shadows, while Wesley would be left standing there to bear every charge. He looked at Cassius, and in that look Marlowe could read the truth unfolding inside his mind. The moment a lackey realized he had never been a partner at all, only the scapegoat fattened and kept ready for this very day. Fear of death overwhelmed loyalty in Wesley with astonishing speed, and he did the only thing a coward knew how to do when cornered. He tried to save himself by selling out his master. Wesley stepped forward, his voice trembling and rushed, saying he would confess everything. He said yes, he had signed those disbursement slips, but he had only been following orders, that Cassius was the one who had set up Tallman Freight. Cassius was the one who had directed every theft, and Cassius was the one who had ordered him to plant the earring in the maid's room to silence her when she began to catch the scent of what was happening. The confession poured out of Wesley's mouth like water bursting through a broken dam, each sentence stripping another layer from Cassius's mask. He told them about secret meetings, about the slush fund, about the plan to use the file someday to overthrow Tobias, and he told them all of it not because his conscience had begun to ache, but because of the cold calculation of a man bargaining for his own life, trading loyalty for the hope of mercy. Everyone in the room could see that. No one mistook Wesley for a hero. He was nothing more than a rat fleeing a sinking ship and biting his old master on the way out. Cassius, seeing his lacquer betray him right before his eyes, finally let the polished shell fall away completely, and the real man beneath it emerged in a way that sent a chill through the entire room. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face twisted with a cold fury, and he turned to Wesley, hissing that he was a stupid coward, then turned to the whole council, and instead of denying the charge, he did something even more frightening. He admitted it. He said, his voice thick with contempt, that yes, he had taken the money, and he asked the whole room in a bitter voice why he shouldn't have, when this family had taken everything from him since he was a child, had abandoned him and his mother, to die slowly in poverty, on the edge of the city, while the main bloodline lived in the velvet comfort of a name that should have belonged to him too. He looked at Tobias, and in his eyes was 15 years of compressed resentment. He said he was only taking back what had always been his, that he deserved to sit in that chair at the head of the table 100 times more than Tobias did, because he had been forced to crawl up from the mud while Tobias had been handed everything, and that he didn't regret a single cent he had taken, or a single scheme he had set in motion. That furious confession destroyed him even faster than Wesley's testimony had, because now there was nothing left to doubt. His own mouth had confirmed everything Marlowe had exposed, and the entire council, men who lived by a code in which betrayal of the family was the gravest sin and could not be forgiven, turned their backs on him all at once in the heavy silence of a sentence already passed without any need for a vote. Marlowe stood in the middle of the room, her body still trembling from the strain, but her back still straight, and she saw the moment power shifted, the moment the predator who had entered this room, so certain of himself, became the prey surrounded by the very wolves he had once called allies. Tobias slowly rose from his chair at the head of the table, and every eye turned to him in expectation, because everyone understood that under the laws of this world, what happened next to the exposed traitor could only be one thing, and the fate of Cassius Ferraro now lay entirely in the hands of the man he had plotted to destroy. Cassius, reading the death sentence in the silence of the entire room, understood that he had nothing left to lose, and a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. In the instant when every eye was still fixed on Tobias, waiting for his judgment, Cassius acted. He snatched the gun hidden beneath the jacket of the nearest guard with a speed no one was ready for, and the room, which had been suffocating beneath the solemn weight of a trial, suddenly exploded into chaos. The first gunshot tore through the air and buried itself in the wall just behind Tobias as he managed to dodge aside, and everyone in the room dove for cover amid shouts and the crash of chairs overturning. Cassius, his eyes bloodshot with hatred and desperation, did not aim at Tobias first, but swung the barrel toward Marlowe, the woman who had stripped him bare, the woman he saw as the cause of everything collapsing, and with a roar he shouted that if he had to lose everything, he would drag down the snake that had bitten him first. Marlowe stood frozen in the middle of the room, too stunned to run, one hand instinctively wrapped around her belly, and she saw the black mouth of the gun turn toward her, as though she were seeing death itself call her name. But in that moment between life and death, a figure lunged forward. Frankie Doyle, the loyal driver and guard who had followed Tobias for so many years, the quiet man with a time-worn face whose name Marlowe had only just learned, did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. He threw himself between Marlowe and the gun barrel, just as Cassius pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and Frankie's sturdy body jerked hard as the bullet drove into his chest, but he kept moving forward, using the weight of his own falling body to shove Marlowe aside and out of the bullet's path, shielding her with the very body being shot. At the same time, Tobias had drawn his gun, and his men had reacted as well. A burst of answering fire thundered through the room, and Cassius, struck in the shoulder and then in the leg, staggered and fell, the gun flying from his hand, the last madness of his revolt extinguished in an instant by the very violent world he had chosen to live in. But no one in the room celebrated, because in the middle of the floor, in a widening pool of blood, Frankie Doyle was lying there. Marlowe crawled to his side, her trembling hands pressing against the wound in his chest as she tried to stop the bleeding, her mouth calling his name, begging him to hold on, and Tobias had already dropped to his knees beside them, the face of the most powerful man in Providence twisting for the first time with a pain he couldn't hide as he lifted the old guard's head. Frankie looked up at the two of them with eyes already beginning to dim, and a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. He rasped to Tobias that he had followed him, since Tobias was still a boy, kneeling and crying beside his sister's body on the sidewalk, that he had heard him make that vow all those years ago, no one gets left behind, and that he was only doing the very thing Tobias had taught all of them for so many years. He shifted his eyes to Marlowe, and with the last of his fading breath he said the baby had to live, that a life not yet born mustn't be left behind, and that he was glad the last thing he could do in this world was keep one small life moving forward. Then his hand squeezed Tobias's hand once, lightly, and let go. Marlowe broke down, tears falling onto the face of the man who had traded his life for hers and her child's, a man who had been almost a stranger, and had given her the greatest gift one human being could give another. And in that painful moment she understood that Tobias's vow, the principle she had once thought was only the hardness of a kingpin, had in fact sunk so deeply into the flesh and blood of the people in this house that a man had been willing to die for it. Tobias knelt there, holding his fallen comrade, and when he lifted his eyes toward Cassius, who lay groaning and restrained on the other side of the room, there was a storm in his gaze that Marlowe had never seen before, the pain of loss, the primal fury demanding blood for blood, and the struggle against the very vow that had just been written again in Frankie's blood before his eyes. And she knew that the true moment of judgment, the moment that would decide not only Cassius's fate but Tobias's soul, had only now truly begun. The fall when Frankie pushed Marlowe out of the bullet's path had saved her life, but it had not come without a price, because right in the middle of the agonizing grief for the fallen guard, Marlowe suddenly felt a sharp, tearing pain rise from deep in her lower belly, a pain unlike anything she had ever known, and when she looked down, her face must have gone deathly white. Because Odette, who had just rushed into the room, screamed for someone to come. The pain seized her in waves, each one more violent than the last, and in that numbing panic, Marlowe could only wrap both arms around her belly, as though she could shield the life inside with her own body, her mouth stammering pleas not for herself but for the baby, begging it not to leave her, begging it to hold on. Tobias, still kneeling beside Frankie's body, jerked his head up when he heard her cry, and in that instant something inside him collapsed completely. The cold shell he had built over 15 years, the mask of the kingpin who never showed emotion, all of it vanished in a heartbeat, revealing a man utterly terrified by the thought of losing the thing he had only just realized he couldn't live without. He swept her up in his arms, refusing to hand her to anyone else, carrying her himself as he ran to the car, and all the way to the hospital. He held her against him, one hand pressed to her forehead, his voice, the voice that still made all of Providence tremble, now breaking into stammered reassurances that sounded almost like begging. He told her to hold on, both her and the baby, to hold on for him, not to leave him before he had the chance to fix anything. At the hospital, they took Marlowe into the emergency room and forced Tobias outside, and the most powerful man in the city, the man who could command dozens of armed men with a single nod, suddenly became completely helpless before the closed doors of the emergency room, with no enemy to threaten, no sum of money to spend, no move to make, only the naked waiting that every ordinary human being had to endure. He paced the cold white hallway for hours, and Odette, who had followed them to the hospital, sat silently watching him, and she saw something she had never seen in 30 years of serving the family. She saw Tobias Ferraro pray, his hands, the hands that had given so many bloody orders, now clasped together and trembling, his lips moving around words he had not spoken to anyone since that night on the sidewalk long ago. In those hours of waiting, facing the possibility of losing Marlowe and the child, Tobias was forced to look straight at the truth he had spent weeks avoiding, that the woman he had once signed away, like crossing out an unnecessary line, the woman he had once looked through as though through glass, had become the center of his entire world without his even knowing it, that he didn't want to arrange things for her or provide for her. He simply couldn't bear the thought of a life without her in it. He realized that the fear choking his heart at that moment was not only the fear of losing a child he had never met, but the fear of losing them both. Both the tiny life-proud woman who had dared to stand straight in front of him and demand to be seen as a human being, and in that cold hallway, he silently swore that if she lived, if they both lived, he would spend the rest of his life proving that he had seen her, truly seen her. When the doctor finally came out, Tobias's face went pale in the moment before the verdict, and when the doctor said that they had saved the baby, that the crisis had passed, but Marlowe needed absolute rest. The legs of the man who never buckled before anything had to brace against the wall just to keep him upright, and he lifted a hand over his face, and Odette turned away to give him a little privacy with tears. A man like him would never let anyone see. He was allowed into the room to sit beside Marlowe once she was awake, pale and exhausted in the hospital bed, but still there, still breathing, with the baby still safe inside her, and Tobias pulled a chair close to the bed, took her hand in both of his, bowed his head and pressed it against her hand, and for the first time he did not speak in the language of power or arrangement, but only whispered 2 words, thanking her for staying. And in that quiet hospital room, after they had just crossed the fragile line between life and death, something between them, something that had been deeply fractured, finally began, very slowly, to mend. Cassius didn't die in the burst of gunfire in the dining room. The bullets in his shoulder and leg had only brought him down, not killed him, and Tobias's men had bandaged him and stopped the bleeding not out of mercy, but because in this world a traitor wasn't allowed to die that easily. His death had to be a decision, not an accident. 3 days later, after Marlowe had passed through the crisis and been brought back to the mansion to rest, Tobias finally faced his cousin in the wine cellar, deep beneath the ground, the place the family still used to settle matters that were never meant to see the light of day. Cassius was brought down there with his hands bound, dragging his wounded leg with every step, and they forced him to his knees on the cold stone floor, in the middle of a ring of councilmen, all of them there to witness it, because under the unwritten law of the underworld, a betrayal this blatant demanded a public punishment before the entire family, and the only accepted price for plotting against the boss and causing the death of someone within the house was blood. No one in that cellar doubted what was about to happen. Cassius would die, and he had to die by Tobias's own hand, because that was the law, because a boss who didn't personally deal with the man who'd betrayed him would be seen as weak, and weakness in this world was a deadly luxury. Tobias entered the cellar with a gun in his hand, his face as cold as carved stone, and inside him was a storm no one could see, because every step he took toward the kneeling man trampled across the image of Frankie Doyle lying dead in a pool of blood, the comrade who had traded his life to protect Marlowe and the baby. And the fury in Tobias demanding revenge rose hot and righteous inside him, so powerful it was almost impossible to resist. He stopped in front of Cassius, and Cassius lifted his head to look at him, and the astonishing thing was that in the defeated man's eyes there was no pleading, only a bitter defiance. He told Tobias in a hoarse voice to go ahead, that he'd known this day would come, since he was a starving child on the edge of the city, looking in at the family that had thrown him away. That dying by Tobias's hand was only the inevitable final chapter of a story written long ago by this family's own cruelty. Tobias raised the gun, the cold barrel aimed straight at his cousin's forehead, and the whole cellar held its breath. His finger rested on the trigger, and in that moment drawn tight as a wire, he heard 2 voices tearing at each other inside his head. One screamed for blood to answer blood for Frankie, screamed for punishment against the man who'd nearly killed Marlowe and his child, the voice of anger and of a whole life lived by the law of the jungle, where mercy meant death. But beneath that scream was another voice, softer but more persistent, the voice of the story his father had told him in the room beside the fireplace, about an abandoned child who'd grown into this devil, about the vicious circle of cruelty, breeding cruelty, and that voice whispered to him that if he pulled the trigger now, he wouldn't only kill Cassius, he'd also confirm that the world that had created both of them had been right all along, the world where doors always closed, and blood was always paid back with blood. His hand began to tremble, something that had never happened to Tobias Ferraro, while holding a gun, and the men in the cellar began exchanging confused glances, because the execution that should have happened swiftly was stretching on in a way no one understood. Their boss was standing there with his gun raised, and he wasn't firing. In Tobias's mind, Frankie's face overlapped with Rosalind's, then with the face of the child Cassius had once been, a child he'd never met but now understood, then with the face of Marlowe lying upstairs, recovering with his child inside her, and he saw himself standing at the crossroads he'd feared all his life, the place where he had to choose what his vow truly meant, whether no one gets left behind, included even someone who didn't deserve to be saved. He tightened his grip on the gun, his knuckles whitening, sweat gathering on his forehead, and the whole cellar waited in the thick silence of a moment when a man decides who he's going to be, but his finger still didn't pull the trigger. The gun remained suspended between life and death, and Tobias Ferraro, for the first time in his life, stood motionless, not knowing what he would do next. The sound of the cellar door opening cut through the suffocating silence, and everyone turned to see Marlo standing on the stairs, pale in a coat she had thrown on in haste. One hand braced against the stone wall to keep her balance, the other resting on her belly, because she had left her sickbed despite the doctor's orders after Odette, unable to bear watching Tobias push himself with his own hand across a line he could never return from, had quietly told her. The men in the cellar were stunned by her appearance, and Tobias spun around, a flash of panic crossing his face when he saw her in a place she should never have had to see, and he told her through clenched teeth to get out, that this wasn't a place for her. But Marlo didn't step back. She descended the stairs one by one, slowly and steadily, walking straight into the middle of the cellar, to the side of the man holding the gun, and she didn't look at Cassius kneeling on the floor at all, only at Tobias. She reached out, not to snatch the gun away, not to beg, but simply to place her hand gently on his raised arm, and through that touch she felt the full tremor tearing through him from within. She told him, her voice soft but clear enough for the whole cellar to hear, that she knew he deserved to die, that he had tried to kill her, had caused Frankie's death, and that no one in this room, including her, could blame Tobias if he pulled the trigger. But then she went on, using the very language both he and she understood better than any other language. She said she had lived her whole life with ledgers, and she had learned that every entry could be balanced, a debt could be answered with a credit, a loss could be offset by another figure. Every number, no matter how ugly, could eventually be brought back into balance. But there was exactly one entry in this world that no ledger could ever balance, and that was the debt created when one person killed another out of hatred, because that entry never closed. It only gave birth to another blood debt, and that debt would be carried on to the next page, then the next page after that, demanding more blood and more blood, forever, without ever reaching zero. She told him Cassius had become this devil, because 15 years ago, the family had written him into the debt column and abandoned him, and if Tobias pulled the trigger now, he would only be doing exactly what those people had done back then, carrying that cruel ledger forward into one more generation, and one day another child would grow out of this blood debt and return to collect what was owed. Then her voice softened, and she said the thing that reached deepest into him, that he had sworn beside his sister's body that no one would be left behind on his ground, and she asked him very quietly what that vow meant, if it only applied to people who were easy to love, people who were innocent, people who deserved saving, because anyone could save someone worth saving. That vow only truly mattered in this hardest moment, when the person who needed mercy was the one least worthy of receiving it. She said killing Cassius was easy, and he was more than strong enough to do the easy thing. But she had seen in him a man capable of something harder than that. The man who had stopped the car in the night because of a strange maid, the man who had lifted her up instead of stepping over her, and she said that man, the man who knew how to stop, was the father she wanted the child inside her to know, not a killer in a dark cellar. The cellar sank into absolute silence, and Tobias stood there, his arm still raised with the gun beneath her hand, and Marlo felt the trembling inside him slowly change, no longer the tearing struggle between two urges, but something being lowered, something being laid down. He looked down at Cassius, who was still kneeling there, but had now lifted his eyes to the two of them. And for the first time there was no defiance in those eyes, only the stunned look of a man who had never in his life had anyone stand up for him, especially not the woman he had tried to kill. And then very slowly, one finger joint at a time, Tobias lowered the gun. His arm fell to his side, and a long, shaking breath left his chest, as though he had just set down a burden he had been carrying for 15 years, and in the wine cellar deep beneath Providence, surrounded by men accustomed to living by blood, a man known as the most dangerous man in the city did the most dangerous thing his world could imagine. He chose not to kill. Tobias's choice not to kill Cassius didn't mean Cassius was set free, because forgiveness wasn't the same as indulgence, and what Tobias did after that night in the cellar was a decision that forced the entire council to reconsider the man they had thought they understood. Instead of a bullet, He chose for Cassius a path the underworld rarely used. He stripped him of every position and every piece of power within the family, cut him off from every resource, then turned over all the evidence about the shell company and the embezzled money trail to the authorities in a carefully calculated way that would force Cassius to face the justice of the law without bringing the whole family crashing down with him. It was a move both humane and cold. Cassius would live, but he would pay the price in years behind bars, exposed before the law instead of being allowed to die like a martyr in the dark. And Tobias told him, the last time the two men faced each other, that this wasn't mercy but a chance, the kind of chance no one had ever given him, a chance that someday he might become something other than the product of the cruelty that had created him. Cassius didn't answer, but as he was led away, he looked back at Marlowe once, and in that look something had broken open, not exactly gratitude, but the deep confusion of a man who, for the first time in his life, had to question the entire story he had told himself for years about a world where no one had ever stopped for him. As for Wesley Dorn, the man who had betrayed his master to save himself, Tobias did not give him the contempt he deserved. Instead, he did something that stunned Wesley himself. He kept him working under strict supervision, forcing him to use the very accounting talent he had once used to steal in order to untangle and clean up the ledgers he had dirtied, and Tobias told him that a coward could still become useful if he learned to fear the right thing, and that this was a debt he would repay through labor, not blood. Wesley, who had already prepared himself for death, accepted that chance with the obedience of a man who understood he had just been given more than he deserved, and though no one considered him a good man, he began to work with the diligence of someone trying to redeem at least a small part of himself. But the greatest change did not lie in the fate of the traitors. It lay in Tobias himself and in the way he began to look again at the entire empire he had built. That night in the wine cellar, when he lowered the gun, had opened inside him a question he could no longer close, the question of where this cycle of blood and cruelty would end, and whether he wanted his unborn child to grow up only to stand one day in a cellar with a gun raised in his hand. He began, slowly and carefully, the hardest work a man in his position could undertake, pulling the family step by step out of the shadows, shifting illegal resources into legitimate businesses, closing one hidden artery after another, and opening roads that could be seen beneath sunlight, and he knew it would be a long road, measured in years, full of danger and resistance, but for the first time he had a reason large enough to walk it, and at the center of all these changes was Marlowe. Tobias no longer hid the relationship between them or the truth about the child. He publicly welcomed her into the mansion, not as a maid being arranged for, but as his woman, the mother of his child, and he did it before the entire family with a firmness that did not allow anyone to dare whisper behind her back. But what truly made Marlowe believe he had changed was not that public acknowledgement. It was the way he gave her something even more precious than status, real work. He placed in her hands the authority to manage and restructure all the family ledgers during the transition, not because she was the baby's mother, but because she was the best person he had ever met at reading the truth hidden inside numbers, and through that act, he finally answered the question she had thrown in his face in anger many weeks earlier. He had seen her, not as a mistake that needed to be provided for, not as a maid but as a human being with value of her own, someone he needed. In those days, life inside the mansion moved with a new rhythm, quieter and warmer. Two people who had once stood at the farthest ends of the world now sitting together for hours over pages of ledgers. No longer kingpin and servant, no longer judge and accused, but two people rebuilding something from the ruins together, and between them, slowly, as all worthy things come slowly, the trust that had once been shattered was being repaired one number, one day at a time. The baby was born on an early spring morning, a healthy little girl whose cry rang through the hospital corridor, and Tobias Ferraro, the man whose name had once made all of Providence hold its breath, stood silently beside the hospital bed with reddened eyes as he held his daughter in his arms for the first time, feeling that tiny weight as though an entire new life had been entrusted to him to protect. They gave her a name that carried the memory of the man who had fallen so she could live, a quiet way to make sure their gratitude to Frankie Doyle would never fade, and each time they called their daughter's name, both of them remembered that this life was a gift passed into their hands by someone who had been willing to die so no one would be left behind. More than 1 year had passed since the night in the wine cellar, and the lives of two people who had once stood at the farthest ends of the world had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Marlo was no longer the maid who had collapsed asleep in the garden with her old suitcase. She was now the woman standing beside Tobias, in the long and difficult work of leading the family out of the shadows. The hands once calloused from scrubbing floors, now turning the pages of an entire empire being made clean, and the mind an entire world had once looked down on had become the most valuable thing in this house. But the achievement they were proudest of wasn't the legal investments slowly replacing the hidden arteries of the old world. It was what they had done with the Ferraro mansion itself. The great house where bloody orders had once echoed, where Marlo had once been cast out into the cold garden at night, had gradually become something entirely different, a place that sheltered people life had left by the roadside, single mothers with nowhere to go, orphaned children. People's society had been too quick to cross out of its own ledger. And on the gate leading into the garden, the place where everything had begun, there was now a line carved into wood that Marlo had chosen herself. No one is left behind here. Tobias often stood by the window in the morning, looking down at that garden, where now, instead of one woman collapsed in despair, there was the laughter of people being given a second chance, and he understood that the vow he had once cried out in agony beside his sister's body so many years before had finally found its true shape, not in violence or power, but in kindness given every day to the people least expected to receive it. And perhaps this is exactly what this story is meant to leave behind, that the person the world is quickest to underestimate, the one seen as a burden, the one pushed to the margins, is often the very person holding an entire future in their hands, and that a human being's worth is never measured by status or appearance or the work they do, but by the dignity within them that no poverty or contempt can take away. In all the calculations of life, the only entry that always gives the right result is kindness given to someone when they need it most. That moment when someone chooses to stop instead of stepping past, chooses to lift another person up instead of leaving them in the dust, and any one of us, on any road, on any morning, can be the person who chooses to stop. If the story of Marlo and Tobias has touched your heart, we hope you'll subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that every day we can keep listening together to more meaningful stories that move the soul. How do you feel about this story, and what does it remind you of in your own life? Have you ever been the one who stopped for someone? Or has someone ever stopped for you when you needed it most? Please leave a comment and share what you feel from deep in your heart, because we truly want to hear your story. May today's story leave something warm inside you, a gentle reminder that goodness still exists, and that each of us has the power to give it, and that respecting the dignity of every human being, whoever they are and wherever they stand, is what gives this life its truest meaning. Thank you for listening until the very last moment, and we also wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life each day, and a heart that remains peaceful. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.